Happy Holi! Happy Easter to all those celebrating. Welcome to Vajrabharavi. Today we are going to get into the Sakya clan, the Khön family, and the Sakya school of Vajrayana Buddhism. Why? Because His Holiness 41st Sakya Khön gave us long life empowerment yesterday in Darjeeling. I am not in Darjeeling, but you still get empowered virtually. And I'm so grateful. And they sent this from Walden in the US. And His Holiness is going to Walden. So we welcome you. And I'm going to read from Dr. Sam Van Skyek's book on Tibet, where he goes into how the Sakya school basically saved Buddhism. And there's a dynasty / people called the Tangut Xixia. It's like a super mysterious phenomenon because they basically disappeared after the Mongols exterminated all of them. But somehow Mongols also adopted the same religion, which is like wild given the present circumstances of the world where everyone's just like, yeah, World War III. Anyways, I really hope there is no World War III. That is why I'm doing all of this, and let us all devote ourselves towards peace and harmony. Lamas and emperors. The collapse of the Tibetan Empire left a power vacuum in eastern Central Asia in the 10th century. Small kingdoms run by Tibetans, Chinese, and Turks fought among themselves until, as the century drew to a close, a new power began to make itself felt in the region. The Tanguts were a people from the same ethnic background as the Tibetans, but unlike the Asha and the Sumpa, who had been subsumed, like co-opted, eaten up by the Tibetan Empire and by Tibetan culture, the Tanguts lived far enough to the north to have avoided this fate. So Tibet is like north of the Himalayas, and then Tanguts probably were south of modern-day Mongolia. Gansu. They had their own language, and there are conferences organized to study their language, which is super cool in my opinion. After the eclipse of the Tibetan power, they moved south to claim the old Tibetan dominions. Once the Tanguts had established a small empire on the Silk Route, they lost no time in turning themselves into a literate and sophisticated culture. Just as the Tibetans had done some centuries earlier, they created a writing system from scratch, though theirs was based on a Chinese rather than an Indian model. Then they began the mammoth project of translating the entirety of Buddhist literature into their own written language, working with all the books they could obtain, whether in Sanskrit, Chinese, or Tibetan. Alongside this project, which stretched nearly 200 years, the Tanguts translated Confucian classics, wrote down their own oral literature, and composed new works such as a huge Tangut Chinese dictionary. Since their empire included the northern reaches of the Tibetan cultural area, the Tanguts soon became familiar with the Tibetans. By the 12th century, Tibetan lamas, the Tibetan term is a translation of the Sanskrit guru, but it became to be used for all high-ranking Buddhist monks, were becoming deeply involved with the Tangut court. Some were even honored with the title of imperial preceptor, but the Tanguts were not to enjoy lasting power. Their empire and the edifice of learning and culture that they had erected so quickly were about to be swept away by the brute force of a much more powerful empire, that of the Mongols. In their hubris, the Tanguts refused to surrender to the Mongols. This only hastened their destruction, which came about when Chenggis Khan himself led an army against the Tangut capital in 1225. After a year of siege and violence, the Tangut capital, Xingzhou, was completely destroyed by the Mongol army. Genghis died in the midst of the campaign, but his tactics were apparent in the complete razing of the capital. A fate Genghis always threatened for those who would not surrender. In the end, the flower of Tangut civilization had lasted for little more than 2 centuries, yet this short-lived culture survived in 2 ways. First, through the manuscripts dug up from the sand of the Silk Route, one of the great finds of the 20th century Russian exploration. And second, through the Mongols' adoption of many of the Tangut's best ideas, such as the patronage of the Tibetan lamas. After the death of Genghis, the vast empire that he had created was divided between his descendants in a series of messy, dispute-ridden successions, reminiscent of those that had racked the Tibetan Empire centuries earlier. The Tibetan borderlands of Amdo came under the rule of Godun, one of Genghis's grandsons. Though he wanted to do something about Tibet, Godun was not immediately sure what was possible. This vast and inhospitable land was split into dozens of petty kingdoms, apparently united only in their devotion to Buddhism. Now, the example of the Tangut Empire came into play. Godun wondered whether he could bring Tibet into the Mongolian Empire through the same patronage of Buddhism that the Tanguts had practiced in Amdo. To begin with, he sent a small Mongol army into Tibet headed by a general of Tangut descent. Despite the small size of the force, the Tibetans could muster no serious resistance as the army marched into Tibet in 1240. When the army finally reached the famous monastery of Radrang, it threatened to put the inhabitants to the sword. The abbot surrendered, and when he was asked who might represent the Tibetans at the Mongol court, he suggested Kunga Gyaltsen, the 4th Khön descendant to sit in the Sakya throne. Thanks to his deep understanding of the Sanskrit language and Indian culture, he was known by the respectful name Sakya Pandita. In his great knowledge of Indian Buddhism, Sakya Pandita had an eye for what he saw as Tibetan aberrations. Naturally conservative, he was suspicious of teachers who promised enlightenment without the need to pass through all the stages of Buddhist practice. Tibet's scholastic tradition and Tibetan Buddhism is very much a scholastic tradition, owes much to Sakya Pandita, and his works are still on Tibetan monastic curricula today. In this one, Finding Happiness in Difficult Times, Sakya Khön Rinpoche actually talks about this Q&A. Somebody asked is it the same for someone to be handicapped and study Buddhism? And said, it's better to be able-bodied. So that is the kind of conservatism you can kind of get from just these Q&As. And I also feel that some days I'm very grateful for my vehicle that allows me to, wake up at a certain times and be cogent and conscious to deliver this lecture to y'all. The general took Sakya Pandita's name back to Godun. For a while, Godun was distracted by other things, but a few years later, in 1244, he decided that the time had come to summon a representative of the Tibetans to his court. Sakya Pandita was already in his 60s when the invitation arrived. It was not the sort that could be refused with impunity, so he had little alternative but to accept. Still, he traveled at a leisurely pace with his 2 young nephews. Arriving at Godun's court in the summer of 1246, Sakya Pandita agreed in principle to act as a representative for Tibet. This involved little more than writing and signing a long letter, which was circulated among the local clan leaders of Tibet, and which stated that they were all to accept Mongol rule unconditionally. From now on, their authority would depend on their recognition by the Mongol ruler. Sakya officials would oversee the administration of the local clan holdings and assist in collecting taxes for the Mongols. Since resistance had now been shown to be useless, these demands were to be met at once. Seeing no alternative, the clan leaders accepted. patron priest. Sakya Pandita never returned to Tibet, passing away in 1251 in the temple that Godin had built for him. With nobody on the scene to support Sakya interests, Tibet was carved up into administrative districts known as myriarchies, with each member of the Mongol royal family responsible for a different Buddhist clan. Godin could continue to patronize Sakya, but the school would have no special influence in Tibet. The present Khan, Mongke, chose to patronize the Drikung, followers of Marpa's Kagyu lineage, who had become so successful in Tibet that there was now a saying, all mountains are Drikung's mountains, all plains are Drikung's plains. So His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche is of the Drikung Kagyu, and they are in the US, based in Arizona. After the death of Sakya Pandita, the two young nephews who had traveled from Tibet with him were left to fend for themselves at the court of a Mongol prince called Kubilai. Moving easily between Mongol and Tibetan cultures, Pagpa and Chagna counted Mongol princes as their friends and became acquainted with the famous lamas of Tibet who came to stay at Kubilai's court, such as the Karmapa and the leader of the Zur clan. And Kubilai was becoming increasingly interested in Buddhism. In 1258, he asked Pagpa for a major tantric empowerment, which, as Kubilai knew, would establish Pagpa as his tantric guru, a serious relationship that allowed for no fallings out. In the same year, Pagpa headed a major debate with the Taoists, who had been converting Buddhist monasteries and burning Buddhist books. When he won the debate, Pagpa celebrated his victory with a poem drawing upon Indian poetics, slyly using the Taoist alchemical practices as a metaphor for their conversion to Buddhism. So here goes the poem. The supreme teacher of the Taoists, following the one they call Lao Tzu, is well versed in the text of his tradition, but became completely intoxicated by pride in his considerable fame and looted and burned our books, applying the elixir that transforms the iron of a sound intellect into the golden teachings of genuine scripture. I transformed him into a holder of the vows of the excellent yogic conduct of the Buddha. After his success in the debate, Pagpa's reputation soared, and it became clear that he was now a major player at the court of Kubilai. Then, the following year, Mongke suddenly died. What followed was effectively a civil war between different Mongol princes, destroying forever what remained of the unity wrought by Genghis. The fighting lasted 4 years, ending in 1264, with the Mongol Empire divided between the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhans in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and Kubilai's empire in the east. Realizing that he needed to resolve the Tibet problem, Kubilai declared that the 13 myriarchies of Tibet were henceforth to be ruled by Sakya, and gave Pagpa the title of state preceptor. However, the Ilkhans in Persia refused to comply and continued to support the Pagmodru and Drikung rulers in western Tibet. This was to be a constant source of strife over the years to come. I didn't know the Ilkhanids of Persia were supporting Tibetan Buddhists. I thought they were Muslim. While he was occupied in establishing a new capital near Beijing, Kubilai sent Pagpa back to central Tibet with imperial documents asserting his authority and a small army to back him up. Pagpa had not seen Sakya Monastery since his childhood. Once he had settled in, he supplemented his political duties with religious work, writing Buddhist treatises and making plans for building the great temple at Sakya on the one hand, while negotiating with the ever-troublesome Drikung, still supported by the Ilkhans of Persia on the other. Pagpa hoped to bring western Tibet under the wing of Sakya by persuading the Drikung to accept a small territory south of Lhasa instead. Unsurprisingly, the Drikung weren't keen, and the negotiations failed. So in some of our supplications to the former lamas of Drikung, there's like a section in the prayer book where it says, Chinese kings pay homage to the Drikung, Persian kings pay homage to the Drikung, Indian kings pay homage to the Drikung. And I guess this is where it originates, because I didn't know Persian kings actually supported the Drikung Kagyu. Just 2 years after being in Tibet, Pakpa was summoned back to the Mongol court. If there was any sadness in his life of exile, it would have been made much worse by the sudden death of his younger brother Chagna, who had been his constant companion ever since they had traveled with their uncle to meet with the Mongols for the first time over 20 years before. As Pakpa traveled east, Kubilai's army was traveling to the other direction to finish by force what Pakpa had been unable to do by negotiation. Oh my gosh. This invasion was directed by the chief administrator, the head of non-religious affairs at Sakya. He was in some ways the most powerful man in Tibet, even if in theory he had to answer to the abbot of Sakya monastery and the imperial preceptor at the Mongol court. Kubilai's army forced the Drikung to give up their western Tibetan lands to Sakya. This high-handedness was an unforgivable insult to the Drikung and the Ilkhans. The struggle for Tibet was by no means over. This is some really dramatic stuff. We need like a TV show. Back at the new Mongol capital near present-day Beijing, Pakpa had much to keep him occupied. Shortly after his arrival, Kubilai announced that Pakpa was to take responsibility for a very important project, creating a new writing system for his whole empire. Since Kubilai's empire now spanned China, Tibet, and the old Inner Asian territories of the Mongols, no imperial order could be generally understood until it had been translated into several languages. Sounds like a huge headache. As an intelligent man who knew the different scripts of the Mongols, the Tibetans, and the Chinese, Pakpa was ideal for the job. Throwing himself into this tremendous task, he developed an alphabet that took most of its forms from Tibetan, but like the Mongol and Chinese scripts, was written from top to bottom. So the old Chinese was also written like top to bottom, not left to right. That was like a 20th century thing, reform. Pakpa showed the completed script to Kubilai in 1269. The Khan was very pleased, rewarding Pakpa with the rank of imperial preceptor. In effect, Pakpa was now the highest religious authority in the whole of Kubilai's empire, including China. Kubilai immediately made the new script compulsory for official documents and seals. In the end, the script, named after its creator, Pakpa, was only used until the fall of the Mongols, which was not far off. Though Pakpa was held in high regard by Kubilai, he preferred to stay away from the hustle and bustle of court life. He therefore moved to northern Amdo, an area rich in Tibetan culture and Buddhist monasteries, but within the reach of the Mongol capital. After a few years spent mainly in religious rather than political work, Pakpa returned to Kubilai's court, but only to ask the Khan's permission to go back to central Tibet. It may be that word had reached Pakpa that all was not well at Sakya monastery. Kubilai let Pakpa go, though he had to strip him of the rank of imperial preceptor, which could only be held by a monk at the court. In fact, Pakpa had already stretched this rule by living so far from the court. On his journey home, Pakpa encountered armed opposition from the Amdo Tibetans and had to be escorted by the troops of 3 Mongol princes. When he arrived at Sakya Monastery again in 1276, he found that the Western Tibet problem had not gone away. The Drikung and Pagmodru were still trying to lay claim to more territory. With military support from the Mongol allies in Persia, they represented a serious threat. Seeing how little had changed since he was last in central Tibet and how little difference Kubilai's military interventions had made, Pakpa decided to convene a major religious conference. After all, one thing that disputing Tibetan factions had in common was their devotion to Buddhism. Kubilai's son and heir, Prince Jinggen, provided the funding for the conference. Pakpa thanked him by making the dedicatee of illuminating the objects of knowledge, a Buddhist textbook that, as well as being famous in Tibet, was translated into Chinese and Mongolian. So illuminating the objects of knowledge remembers Prince Jinggen for helping the Buddha Dharma. As a gesture of non-sectarian goodwill, Pakpa nominated a Kadampa monk, the abbot of Nartang Monastery, to chair the conference. As a result of the success of the conference, peace reigned for a while in Tibet. A few years after this last great achievement, Pagpa passed away in Sakya Monastery in December 1280. It was an untimely death, for Pagpa was only 45, but he had achieved much. Thrust into the limelight at a young age, he had shown maturity and a flair for diplomacy. He also approached his religious studies and practice with great seriousness. And this, above all, seems to have impressed Kubilai and others at court. Pagpa constantly negotiated between the interests of the Mongol court, those of his own Sakya monastery, and those of the quarrelsome clan leaders of Tibet. These tensions were not over. No sooner had Pagpa been laid to rest than rumors started flying that he had been poisoned. Patrons and priests, 1250 to 1315, life under the Mongols. The poisoning was blamed on the former chief administrator, who had been fired when Pagpa returned to Tibet in 1276. It was no surprise then that after Pagpa's sudden and unexpected death, suspicion soon had fallen on this man. It was well known that he had resorted to poisoning in order to bring Western Tibet under Sakya rule. With news of suspicion reaching Kubilai, he decided that only a strong intervention would end this insurrection in Sakya.